So the ranking member will be here momentarily, and I'm Congressman Dana Rohrabacher. I'll introduce myself to you. Chairman of the subcommittee. Here's Russ Carnahan, our ranking member right now. So I just was going to explain to them, how long have you been in here, Russ? How many years have you been a member?
In 04.
When,
was elected in 04.
Russ was elected in 04. I was elected in 88. And we've seen a big turnover in Congress since then. And I remember when I first got here, there was some guy in his 90s, and he would tell us he would be there, and he'd go, I dreamed I was giving a speech on the floor of the House of Representatives. And I woke up, and I was giving a speech on the floor of the House of Representatives. All right, so are you ready? Okay. This hearing of the Oversight and Investigations Subcommittee of the House Foreign Affairs Committee is called to order. And I want to welcome all of you and Mr. Carnahan. And of course, today our subject for this hearing is China's public diplomacy policies. And the two pillars of America's status quo as an open society are freedom of the press and academic freedom. Communist China, which does not believe in or allow the practice of either type of this freedom, is exploiting the opportunities offered by America, as we are consistent with those values, to penetrate both private media and public education to spread its own state propaganda. When Americans debate and discuss issues of the day, the assumption is that while many views may differ, citizens are trying to find the best outcome or policy that will benefit their country. No such assumption applies to the agents of foreign powers who are advancing what serves the interests of their own dictatorship, which is in competition with our country. Beijing is pouring billions of dollars into the country's state-run media machine, which is churning out new TV networks, radio stations, and newspapers aimed at foreign audiences. China Daily is delivered on a weekly basis to nearly every office on Capitol Hill and claims 2/3 of its readers are opinion leaders in government or business. Nearly every American home with a satellite or cable TV has multiple channels presented by the Chinese Communist government. They present a mixture of news and entertainment programs, just like a regular network. But there is no warning label informing the audiences that what views are expressed or embedded in the programs are those of a foreign power, let alone a rival communist dictatorship that considers us to be the enemy. Less obvious to the general public, but a major undertaking by Beijing, is the creation of over 70 Confucius Institutes and classrooms at American universities and high schools. Confucius Institutes provide money, textbooks, and teachers from China funded by the communist regime in Beijing. The U.S. schools provide facilities, matching funds, and legitimacy to the Chinese propaganda effort. Under the guise of education, the Confucius Institutes convey Beijing's version of cultural values and history in forms that can be described as propaganda and have been so described by communist officials from China themselves. History is part of the cultural curriculum that includes the assertion that Tibet and Taiwan are now and always have been Chinese territories. Another subtle message is that socialism with Chinese characteristics creates a harmonious society in which everyone should envy. The headquarters of the Confucius Institutes is the Hanban, located in Beijing. The Hanban recently won a Red Song contest held by the Ministry of Education on the theme, "Following the Communist Party Forever." Is this ideology compatible with American values of academic freedom? Are American universities selling not just classroom space, but their souls in order to get grants and Chinese money into their institutions? Here to answer these and other questions is a distinguished panel, and we are grateful for you being with us today. Mr. Stephen Mosher, President, Population Research Institute. He is the author of a number of books, including the path-breaking Broken Earth, which exposed China's notorious one-child policy and hegemon China's plan to dominate Asia and the world in 2002. His most recent book, ClimateGate, the Cutable Letters, which came out in 2010, is also one of his books, and he has also written for the Wall Street Journal, the New Republic, the Washington Post, National Review, Catholic World Report, Human Life Review, First Things, and numerous other publications. Then we have Mr. Kai Chen, a Chinese freedom activist. His book of 2007, and that is One in a Billion, Journey Toward Freedom, tells of the horrors of living under communist rule and of his escape from China during the Cultural Revolution. He is now an American citizen and a graduate of UCLA in political science. He played for China's national basketball team, and his daughters played for their American college teams. That's terrific. And Mr. Greg Autry, co-author of Peter Navarro's, quote, Death by China, Confronting the Dragon, A Global Call for Action, which was published last year by Prentice Hall. He is working on a PhD at the University of California at Irvine, and he is also a partner in Network Corporation and WiredImages.com. He's a Southern California professional systems consultant, and that group is consulting. The group was founded in 1997. Finally, we have Mr. Robert Daly, Director of Maryland China Initiative, the University of Maryland, from the University of Maryland. Prior to taking up his current post in 2007, he was, for 6 years, American Director of the Johns Hopkins University Nanjing University Center for Chinese and American Studies in Nanjing, China. He began work in the United States-China relations with the United States Information Agency, in which he served from 1986 to 1991. He then taught Chinese at Cornell in 91 to 92, and for the next 9 years he worked on television projects in China as a host, actor, and writer, and also served as a commentator in U.S.-China relations. I want to thank you all, and Mr. Carnahan, do you have an opening statement?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, and again, thank you for the work that you do with this committee and subcommittee. I appreciate the work that we do together. We don't always come at it from the same direction, but we have been able to find some great common ground to work together on this committee, and I appreciate your work and your friendship. I want to thank you for holding this hearing. I am a very strong supporter of public diplomacy as a key piece of our smart power strategies on behalf of the United States. I'm encouraged by your commitment to exploring multiple aspects of these policies, including how other countries conduct public diplomacy in the U.S. and abroad. Public diplomacy programs are a critical and indispensable component of U.S. foreign policy. Many of these programs are cost-effective ways to conduct public diplomacy. Establishing American cultural centers around the world has been and should be a continued part of that policy. No doubt the barriers presented by the Chinese government to establish these has presented a challenge. I would encourage the administration to continue to advocate that the Chinese government provide us with the same access that they are allowed with the establishment of their Confucius centers. However, I do not believe that limiting U.S. access will lead to the Chinese government allowing the establishment of U.S. government-funded cultural centers, nor do I believe it's in the best interest of a free and open society like ours to do so. When you look broadly at public diplomacy in China, there are numerous ways that are currently being effective. I would point to a few. The establishment over the past few years of several American corners at several public and university libraries. While these certainly are not U.S. government run, as in other parts of the world, they're nonetheless an avenue to bring American culture and values to China. Other universities, like in my home city of St. Louis, Webster University, offers a wide array of opportunities in China, from joint degree programs to exchanges. Bringing the value of American education to China from schools like Webster University will help our public diplomacy efforts. And student exchanges continue to be one of the best ways to advance our long-term interest. Young people and students can be some of our best diplomats. Current estimates show that 10 times as many Chinese students study in the U.S. compared to the number of American students studying in China. So there was much work to be done there. Efforts to increase American students studying in China, such as the 100,000 Strong Initiative, will help foster a greater understanding of American culture, as well as those students bringing back better knowledge of China. We need to continue engagement with the Chinese government and the Chinese people in all possible ways. I look forward to hearing about how we can continue these efforts, and again, want to thank the witnesses up front for being here today.
Thank you very much, Mr. Carnahan. We'll start with Stephen Mosher. Might I suggest that if you could keep your initial statement down to 5 minutes, we will then put the rest of your statement in the record, and then we will proceed with questions and answers once all of you are done with your testimony. Mr. Mosher, you may proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this, this important hearing.
Now I'm going to ask you to put that mic very close to your mouth. You know, actually, I have got what they call surfer's ear. And, you know, when you go surfing and you go in the cold water, it actually hurts your hearing sometimes. And so the more you can speak into that microphone, the better they can hear you, but also the better I can hear you. So it would be very nice.
Well, I was born and raised in California, so I understand exactly from personal experience what you're talking about.
Go for it.
My testimony today is entitled Confucius Institute's Trojan Horses with Chinese Characteristics, which I think gives you an insight into my view of this particular initiative on the part of the United Front Work Department of the Chinese Communist Party. Now, Confucius Institutes are described as nonprofit public institutions aligned with the government of the PRC, whose purpose is to promote Chinese language and culture. But there are literally now thousands of academics around the world who have voiced concern that these seemingly benign purposes leave out a number of other purposes, namely sanitizing China's image abroad, enhancing its soft power globally, and creating a new generation of China watchers who are well disposed towards the communist dictatorship. Now, these are not like Germany's Goethe Institute. The Confucian Institutes are not independent from the government, nor do they occupy their own premises. Instead, they are embedded within established universities and colleges around the world and are directed by an organization which is known as the Office of Chinese Language Council International. But this answers in turn in academic matters to the Ministry of Education and in practical matters to the United Front Work Department of the Chinese Communist Party. In fact, the chairman of the Confucius Institute is none other than Liu Yandong, who served as the head of the United Front Work Department from 2002 to 2007. Now, what is the United Front Work Department? The purpose of the United Front Work Department of the Chinese Communist Party is subversion, co-option, and control. Now, during the Communist Revolution, it subverted and co-opted a number of other political parties, such as the Chinese Socialist Party, into serving the interests of the Chinese Communist Party. After the establishment of the PRC, it continued to control these parties, which were allowed to exist on sufferance, albeit as hollow shells, creating the illusion of quote-unquote democracy in China. That it has de facto control over the Confucius Institute suggests more strongly than anything else that one of the chief purposes of these institutes are namely to subvert, co-opt, and ultimately control Western academic discourse on matters pertaining to China. Now, you know, I'm particularly troubled by this aspect of the Confucian Institute initiative because of my own experience. As you mentioned during your introduction, you know, I have some personal experience in how the Chinese party state deals with its overseas academic critics. Because following my expose of human rights abuses in the one-child policy in the early 80s, the PRC, acting then through the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, put tremendous pressure on Stanford University, my university, to deny me the PhD. Beijing went so far as to threaten to abrogate its scholarly exchange program with the United States unless I was, in its words, severely punished for speaking out. In other words, I know from personal experience how ruthless the party can be when it comes to pursuing its own interest, and how sycophantic, not to say craven, some academic administrators can be, again, from personal experience. Now, I'm going to go right to the end here and say this. Given that the Chinese party state does not share our democratic institutions, nor our commitment to open markets, nor our understanding of human rights, its purposes in setting up these Confucius Institutes are diametrically opposed to our national principles. Should we really be allowing a cruel, tyrannical, and repressive regime to educate our young people? And there is a final point. I have long believed that reciprocity should govern our relations with China. There can be no reciprocity in the matter of Confucius Institutes. Imagine the reaction of the United Front Work Department of the Chinese Communist Party if a U.S. government-funded and controlled American institute were proposed to be embedded at, say, Beijing University to teach American language and culture. How many seconds do you think it would take the Chinese party state to say no? How many seconds do you think it would take the Chinese party state to say no to our having government-funded radio shows, television shows in China? Where there is no reciprocity, we should revisit the relationship and demand that it either be allowed or that we fundamentally change our view of how China should be allowed to operate in this country. Thank you very much.
Did you get it? Did you get your PhD from Stanford?
Actually, I didn't. Stanford investigated my research from 1981 to 1986, and at the end of the day, the then president of Stanford University, Donald Kennedy, wrote me a 67-page letter, which the day before he sent it to me, he gave to the New York Times. I got it only after the reporters started calling. And the letter said, basically, after rehearsing all of the charges made by the Chinese party state against me, President Kennedy said, I do not know whether the charges made against you by the People's Republic of China are true or not, but there has been a gradual erosion of trust between you and the university, which makes it impossible for you to get your PhD.
Oh, my.
So at the end of the day, he refused to grant me the PhD on the grounds that he didn't trust me. Well, after 5 years, I didn't trust him much either.
All right. Well, we will ask more questions about that later, and that just shows you what happens. You know, when you're young, your parents always say, don't hang around with these lowlifes, or if you're hanging around with some criminals, you know, it's less likely that you're going to turn them into saints than it is that they're going to hurt your value system, and that sounds like what's happening here. But we have with us a heroic athlete who would like to tell us also a firsthand experience of living under this communist dictatorship and some insights at what he thinks are motives and of what's going on, what we're facing now. Mr. Chen.
Thank you very much, Chairman Rohrabacher, and I truly appreciate your tireless effort in facing down evil. So I thank you here personally. And for me, the distinction that I'm a Chinese freedom activist is a misnomer, but I'm more American than most Americans. And in many ways, I was born American already, only born in the wrong place. So please don't treat me as a Chinese. I'm an American citizen, and I'm here more interested in safeguarding this country, safeguarding American freedom and American security than changing China. So I want to make that clear about it. And secondly, I want to dispel some misconceptions in American public that China is just a normal nation state. China is not a nation state by any standard. China is a party dynasty. Once we have this distinction, we can formulate and implement effective China policies. Otherwise, everything you formulate around normal nation state will fail because it does not behave as a normal nation state. Thirdly, there's a saying that China now is capitalistic, has capitalism in there, but China does not have a shred of capitalism because every inch of the land in China belongs to the government. Not a single inch of land in China belongs to any individual. That distinction will dispel China has capitalism because there's no private property rights. Government can take anything away from you any moment. So thirdly, there's a misconception that since Nixon opened the door, so only the freedom can influence China, and we are safe from despotism and tyranny. But actually, it's two-way street. And nowadays, I'm disturbed and alarmed to find that the U.S. is more or less changed by China than China being changed by U.S., which is, I'll give you a few examples later. So communism was down when the Berlin Wall was collapsed. But communism was not out. It's enjoying a comeback, and through another form, a mutated form, mainly by the Chinese form of government. So I want that to be clear. And a few things it disturbed me and alarmed me is that in America, there's a deterioration of political culture in this country. And from a culture of freedom, gradually toward a culture of moral confusion. And when I went to Alhambra City Hall, I saw in 2007, I saw a portrait, supposedly by an artist, painted George Washington on one side and Chairman Mao on the other side. And they put together. And I protested it. Eventually, they take it down. But it becomes a big controversy. But you can see the extent of penetration of American political culture in that. And also, if I stroll on the street in Los Angeles, there's a Mao's diner, Mao's kitchen in there. Inside is all, cultural revolutionary posters with Americans dining down there. And the poster says, "Down with American imperialism" on top. It's ironic, but another thing is when I went to the Nixon Library, there is a Mao statue sitting in the exhibition called "The World Leaders," and sitting among the likes of Winston Churchill and Charles de Gaulle. And which I say, if Mao leads the world, he leads in murdering people. So how can you reconcile that kind of image? And I engaged before the Beijing Olympics in 2007, a Olympic freedom run over the 4 continents. Just want to tell people that when you go to Beijing Olympics, don't forget Tiananmen Square massacre. But then the US president went to the opening ceremony and saying nothing. And now when Liu Xiaobo was jailed and after, being awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, and a US president will invite those jailers into the White House and give a state banquet. And those are very disturbing. And so I just want to, I don't have time, I just want to conclude that my statement with these 2 images. One is this, is what I picked up in 1989 on Tiananmen Square that says, support the hunger strike, demand equal dialogues. What I want to tell you, this is the aspiration of the Chinese people. But then I'm going to show you another image. This is the reality of China. Then when the US now facing, the Chinese economy, and they see this bill of currency everywhere. There's an image of Mao's portrait on every bill of Chinese currency. But then we are talking about only devaluation, revaluation, or manipulation of the currency in economic terms. But I want you to see the moral terms in this. Once we accept this currency as a normal currency, once we accept China as a normal state, then we accept the fact that killing people, murdering people, and persecuting people to acquire power is acceptable. Once we see that, we cease to be the United States of America, and with principles of freedom upon which this country is established. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that very inspiring testimony. And you're right. It's your commitment to American ideals that makes you an American. And all I can say is, after hearing your testimony, that I know that you are far more American than so many others that I have to deal with quite often. So thank you for that very inspiring testimony. And we need to say this at this time. I don't have any complaints against the Chinese people. None of the comments that we hear today should ever be misreported or misinterpreted as attacks on the Chinese people. In fact, our greatest ally in the struggle for a better world and maintaining and increasing freedom and peace in this world, our greatest ally in that struggle are the people of China, because they are the ones that are on the front lines of this struggle. And we need to make sure we repeat that over and over again, because they will be told that our comments about their oppressors and the dictatorship that rules them with an iron fist, that in some way is disparaging against them. That is an absolute falsehood, but they will use that to try to cut off communication. So let us reaffirm that right at this point. And Mr. Greg Autry, who is a terrific filmmaker. He has produced a film that I would recommend, written a book and produced a film that I would recommend that not all of you see, but you might, if you have various people that you would like to inform about the relationship that we've had with China and what that has done to us, by us compromising without, and us actually not compromising. There's been no compromise, just giveaway. And we have a great documentation as to how this has had a negative impact on the cause of peace, but also the cause of prosperity here in the United States. Greg, you may proceed.
Thank you very much, Chairman Rohrabacher. I greatly appreciate your work on this effort for many years. I'm the co-author of the book Death by China, and I'm testifying on my own behalf, and my views are not the views of the University of California, where I have been a lecturer and I'm completing a PhD in economics and public policy. In the 2 decades since Henry Kissinger convinced America to overlook the massacre at Tiananmen Square, we've been mired in a one-sided trade war camouflaged under Chinese propaganda with the aid of an American fifth column of media pundits, CEOs, and academics who cheer on the rise of state capitalism. They push us to open our markets and our media to a non-reciprocating China with promises of a flat world, but the only thing getting flattened is America's productivity capacity and American values. Our president publicly repeats Chinese propaganda phrases like peaceful rise, while he simultaneously allocates billions of taxpayer dollars to counter China's increasingly aggressive military posture. He legitimizes China's non-democratic system by inviting the next anointed dictator to the White House. Why? The answer to these questions is the reality distortion field, a phrase that was coined by the associates of the late Steve Jobs to describe that man's uncanny ability to induce compliance and agreement in those around him, even when they knew Mr. Jobs' statements were untrue, and even when they were fully aware that they were being manipulated and exploited. Whenever we say People's Republic, we enter the Chinese global reality distortion field, and phrases like peaceful rise and harmonious society lose their frightening Orwellian flavor. Central Chinese television chief Hu Zhanfeng chastised news workers who fancied themselves as journalists rather than accepting their proper role as party propaganda workers. Mr. Hu went on to call strengthening education in Marxist journalism a matter of urgency. This ideological thinking does not stop at China's borders. Why should it? America's ever-hopeful policy of engagement drives a very soft official stance on issues of Chinese domestic and global behavior. Media, academia, and business take their cues from a timid administration and a diffident State Department. Our government's public behavior implies that Communist China is a normal nation to be treated the same as Canada or India. This tacit endorsement allows the Chinese state propaganda machine to run wild and free in America and use our most powerful institutions to project the Communist Party's reality distortion field. American schools and universities are particularly filled with Chinese apologists who convey the CCP's thought work. NYU adjunct Ann Lee writes, quote, China is still being perceived as undemocratic and anti-liberal by the West, but this problem can be easily corrected with more astute public relations training. She doesn't intend to correct the problem of anti-liberal or undemocratic, merely the Western perception. Professor Lee presents China's version of re-educating American youth with their Confucius Institutes when she writes, the strategy of bringing students from other parts of the world to China is similar to the strategy Caesar used when he conquered Gaul. He turned Gauls into Romans who could be trusted to run Gaul for the Roman Empire. Why would our reaction be to our other dictator friends from Saudi Arabia establishing Muhammad Institutes in our schools? If this would not be acceptable, then I ask us why we wish to infuse our students with an infectious ideology from a communist power that's hostile to American values. There are far more Chinese students in the U.S. universities than any other nationality, particularly at the graduate level and increasingly in the critical science, engineering, and business departments. The China Daily explicitly advises Chinese students to apply to the UC campuses because budget cuts there compel us to admit more non-residents. The presumption that democratic America and totalitarian in China enjoy some special relationship is all too common. My university has a newly endowed U.S.-China Institute for Business and Law. The dean of the law school remarks on the website, we are at a unique moment in the history of our two countries in which it is especially important to build bridges between them in business and law, and in each country, the legal system provides a unique framework within which business can flourish. This last sentence establishes an obscene moral equivalency and represents an astounding level of naivete. The ubiquitous China Daily newspaper is the strongest outward manifestation of communist influence in the U.S. I find it all over campus and on every corner here in D.C. Americans have no idea this is a publication of a hostile foreign government. A China Daily editorial recently suggested punishing America and, quote, building a direct link between U.S. bond purchases and U.S. domestic politics. Outrageously, China Daily inserts a monthly print and daily online supplement into the Washington Post entitled China Watch, featuring the large, bold, black masthead of the Washington Post, and hidden below the title China Watch on the other side is a teeny disclaimer, quote, a paid supplement to the Washington Post. Paid by who? I could go on, but I see that my time is running out. I have 4 things I would suggest to the committee. 1, that U.S. publications must be required to clearly reveal when they place content provided by a foreign government or agent of a foreign government. 2, hostile foreign governments that censor U.S. media.
Please repeat that first one again.
Yes.
And slowly.
U.S. publications must be required to clearly reveal when they place content that is provided by a foreign government or an agent of a foreign government. Hostile foreign governments that censor the U.S. media in their domestic markets should not be granted First Amendment rights in America. CCTV and China Daily should have no more access than Fox News or the New York Times do in the Chinese market. 3, U.S. public schools and universities should be prohibited from accepting funding or curriculum from foreign governments or agents of foreign governments, particularly those hostile to America's fundamental principles. 4, direct the FTC to require country of origin information regulations that are credible and punish attempts to conceal foreign products, including permanent visible labeling and registering country of origin information per UPC code so that online vendors can also be required to display this info and mobile apps can display this info. I make that point because one of the most important things about China's reality distortion field is that America's corporations are complicit in supporting it because they know the American consumer is afraid of Chinese products. So one of the most unique pieces of China's distortion field is the hiding of the Made in China label, and I would like to discuss that further.
Your time is up, but
Thank you.
what we could do is perhaps during the question and answer period go through some of your specific suggestions, which are basically trying to alert people when they are confronted with a official propaganda arm of a dictatorship, of a foreign dictatorship. Now, I know that Mr. Daley probably has some opinions that are a little bit different than what we've heard, and so we're going to give you a little bit more time and to state your case, and we'll be very happy you're with us, Mr. Daley, and thank you, Mr. Carnahan, for helping arrange that. Go right ahead.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for inviting me here today, and I want to thank you, too, for the 70th anniversary birthday you threw for the Voice of America China branch a few months ago. I had the honor of attending that. I'm a weekly talking head on current events and U.S.-China relations in Chinese at VOA, and the work that you have done on behalf of the Voice and the branch is very much appreciated. I also want to thank the ranking member for giving me an opportunity to speak to you today on issues that I've worked on now for over 25 years, beginning with formal training in public diplomacy by the United States Information Agency. That was the launch of my career, and it was a very fortuitous launch for me. As you say, I do have different views from those that have been expressed thus far, but not entirely. I take these questions very seriously, and most of the cautions that have been raised about how we deal with China, its public diplomacy initiatives, about reciprocity, these are all well placed. There are, however, some things that I think need to be said to balance some of what has been mentioned so far. Confucius Institutes and the overall characterization of them as being run out of the Chinese government through the Ministry of Education, and yes, Chinese leaders have said very explicitly that this is part of their propaganda effort. That is all true. Confucius Institutes, or sometimes I will call them CIs, the individual institutes, are run by American directors who are hired by the host university. And most American directors that I have spoken with and met with manage their Confucius Institutes with a very high degree, bordering on total autonomy, and in accordance with the needs and standards of the American host institutions. Most of the cultural programs of the Confucius Institutes, moreover, are apolitical by design. As public diplomacy officers on the Chinese side, they're actually quite shrewd. Chinese culture is not presented as, they don't have programs on the glories of the Communist Party. They don't have for example, programs on the renminbi reevaluation, on China's position in the South China Sea, on human rights. They tend to deal in culture as decoration, culture as celebration, culture as friendship ritual. And one of the, if we're going to criticize their programs, one of the things that we can throw at them is that they're often actually can be sort of dull and uninteresting in those ways. They're not, if you are picturing, based on the testimony of my three colleagues, a series of programs that are trying to sell people on communism, I would caution that that really isn't what the Hanban is dealing with. There have been some cases of heavy-handedness, to be sure, at some of the Confucius Institutes, and we could talk about those. Again, I think that caution about the Confucius Institutes is reasonable. Of course, we should not take every pronouncement which the Chinese side makes on Confucius Institutes at face value. Of course, our universities should remain self-critical regarding their motives for establishing Confucius Institutes, and they must, as my colleagues today have said, remain alert to the possible implications of having Chinese government-funded offices on campus. But in advocating vigilance, which I am not claiming that Confucius Institutes are dangerous, because no matter how well-founded our initial skepticism may be, Confucius Institutes in America now also have a record. And I think that it's on that record that they need to be judged. I'd invite any of you to come on up to Paint Branch Elementary School in Prince George's County, to go out to Jenks School System or any of the 10 others in rural Oklahoma that have K-12 Chinese language programs, in part through the facilitation of the Confucius Institutes as well as Americans, and actually get into the classrooms and see for yourselves what is going on. I would argue that the record of the Confucius Institutes to date, with some heavy-handedness in a few cases that I would probably agree with my colleagues here are also egregious, has been a pretty good record. Confucius Institutes are primarily concerned with providing Mandarin training to American professionals and K-12 students. And I want to emphasize, given some of what's been said today about embedded messages and long-term goals of the Chinese side, American students who study Chinese throughout primary and secondary school are likely to take Chinese in college, they are likely to live in China, and to gain an understanding of China's people and its cultures, and to bring that knowledge and an ability to communicate with Chinese counterparts into their careers. Americans who begin Chinese studies in adulthood are likely to develop a nuanced understanding of the challenges in U.S.-China relations and to help us meet those challenges. In other words, Chinese language training, which the Confucius Institutes helps to provide, is profoundly in the American interest. Would I rather that we were paying for it in our interest? Well, yes, I would, but that's not what's happening right now. We have some institutes and some initiatives, but the Confucius Institutes are supporting those. There is, furthermore, nothing about gaining fluency in Mandarin that inclines a student to support the Chinese Communist Party or its policies. I had the privilege, as you mentioned, of working with about 250 of our top young Mandarin speakers when I was the American director of the Johns Hopkins University, Nanjing University Center for Chinese and American Studies. I've worked with them closely. I've lived with them for 6 years. I've stayed in touch with them as they've gone on to careers in, among other things, human rights. One of them is running for Congress. They are Americans who have lived and worked in China. They are as aware of China's failings as any of us. And I would argue, in fact, that America's Mandarin speakers are among our most effective and constructive critics of China. They often see more clearly, because they have the deepest experience and knowledge of China, what China, with all of its talent, with its work ethic, with its great ancient cultural traditions, and its ambition could be if its people were free. Don't we want to have Americans in every profession, in every field of endeavor, to have that ability? Don't we want them to be able to make some of the arguments that have been made today to Chinese in Chinese? Wouldn't that be a good way to go about our public diplomacy? So studying China's languages, its history, and its culture doesn't dull our insights as Americans, it deepens them. I feel very strongly about it. This is why Americans who see China only as a congenial partner and those who see it only as a threat and those in between should all be able to agree on the necessity of Chinese language training in America. Do the CIs raise any kinds of questions? Yes, they do. I think there are two kinds of questions. One that you've raised, I think, correctly about balance and reciprocity. Our Bureau of Public Diplomacy does stand ready to open up more cultural centers, more American libraries staffed by Americans with American cultural programming in China. They are not allowed to do that. Such centers would be welcomed by the Chinese people, so I do want to associate myself with all of the remarks on reciprocity. And the second question, which has been raised broadly, is whether our universities' collaboration with the Chinese government and various agencies of the Chinese government, not only on Confucius Institutes, but on many other programs as well, presents a threat to academic freedom. Again, I think that it is a legitimate question, but I would want to point out that American universities have ample experience in dealing with donors of various kinds, including nations, including corporations, and including individuals who want to shape higher education through their giving. So Hanban doesn't present challenges that are new in kind. It's a familiar set of challenges to American universities, which are also home to most of our leading China scholars who, has been mentioned, are skeptical, and they take a role in shaping their university's response. Just in closing, and in trying to summarize this vast question of public diplomacy very briefly, I think that we need to be a little bit more confident about the institutions of our civil society that are founded on freedom and their ability to engage with China across the board, actively, here and there, to, yes, gradually, slowly, at a pace that doesn't satisfy any of us, but still inexorably does change the state of play on the ground in China. I think we can be a little bit more confident that Americans who have a free press and many sources of news will see CCTV, Xinhua, and the China Daily, for the most part, for what they are. I think we have a pretty good nose for it. I actually think your idea of having a very clear designation, this is provided by a foreign government, that seems to me well worth considering. But I think we can go into this very confidently. There may be one restaurant in LA that has this Maoist theme. There are Hard Rock cafes all over China with pictures of Bob Dylan in them and young Chinese there till 2 o'clock in the morning. There are Starbucks and McDonald's and KFCs and American universities, corporations, images, popular music. We have a public diplomacy deficit with China, but we have an enormous soft power surplus that I think we can be very proud of and confident in. We don't have to go into a defensive crouch over these issues, although I would agree that we should be paying attention to these questions of reciprocity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and we did give you a few extra minutes to make sure that we were able to balance off the opinions there. Well, let me just, I will start off the questions and with a challenge. Mr. Mosher didn't get his PhD.
Right.
We got Chinese government giving, channeling money into our educational institutions, and first thing you know, you got a guy who does a study on the one China or one child China policy and all of its horrendous implications, the murderous implications, and he's denied by the faculty of one of our major universities an academic credit in order to placate these vicious monsters who are actually initiating the murder of every child, unborn child that's the second child of a woman in China. Now, wouldn't you say that, or how, if they're going to be able to pollute the decision-making process of the top faculty at a major university, doesn't that make you fearful that of the incredible influence they could have on everybody else who perhaps are not as educated?
Well, I would have to hear Stanford University's side of it. I've only heard one characterization of these events. I believe they happened quite a while ago, long before the advent of Confucius Institutes. You could correct me if I'm wrong. So I wouldn't want to conflate that with the Confucius Institutes. They may be related, but they're separate issues. I do think that the broad question stands, and I would encourage you to meet with actually academic leaders. We don't have academic leaders on this panel today, and to talk to them about this question of, does the fact that universities not only now teach about China and conduct research about China, but understand themselves as having interests vis-a-vis China that are not necessarily academic interests per se, does that have implications for the universities? I applaud the question. I'm not sure this is the right panel to address it to. I think it would be a good idea to bring in a number of American university faculty. But I would also point out that it's not only American universities that now have China interests, and in some senses China policies, and which therefore, yes, could be subject to certain kinds of suasion. local governments, county governments, city governments, corporations. China and America now are interlinked at all levels. China is very much present at the United States, and there are interests even in public school systems. So it's not simply the university side,
Well, of
but our
course it's not the
NGOs, we all have to
university
address
side,
this issue.
But I was asking, the reason I asked that, because demonstrably, as the university should be, if nothing, more immune to this type of negative influence. Let me just note, I participated in a hearing, in a congressional hearing at Stanford University. And it was a hearing, and I brought up the issue of graduate students from mainland China receiving training in technology projects that are vital to our national security, meaning people don't have to steal some file if they put the file in the head of their PhDs and the PhD goes back to China and develops their weapon system that is now capable of obliterating American lives. The president of Stanford University couldn't understand that. No, we are an educational institution. We're not here for national security purposes.
Right.
Something's wrong with that. And I think that Chinese money has helped grease this misperception. And I mean Chinese, I mean tyranny money from tyrants and gangsters who control a large portion of humankind, have created this monstrous misperception of even the heads of our major universities that they don't have to worry about that.
Right.
Mr. Mosier, we've been using you as an example there. Maybe we'll have a comment all the way down the line, and but we'll start with you, and then we'll go to Mr. Carnahan.
Well, the last witness made an eloquent defense of learning about the Chinese culture and learning the Chinese language, with which I heartily agree. Having learned about Chinese culture and language at the Chinese University of Hong Kong many years ago, and being in the position now of encouraging others to do the same thing, because China, despite the shortcomings of its current political system, is an important international player. Our point here is no one is saying that we should avoid learning those things, only that a party-run organization probably should not be funding, setting the curriculum parameters, and providing teachers for American students to learn these things, because in the process of developing that curriculum and providing those teachers, they are certainly putting certain things out of bounds. I run a nonprofit organization. I'm very aware of the kinds of pressure that funding organizations, be they individuals or foundations or governments, can put on you. And I guarantee you that the directors of the Confucian Institutes are very clear about who is filling their rice bowl, and are very careful not to raise subjects that would irritate those who have the power to break that same rice bowl.
Okay. Mr. Chen.
All right, I have been actively involved in the protest in Southern California in a school district called Hacienda La Ponte Unified School District, in which the Chinese consulate and Hanban targeted to implement their Confucius classrooms. I examined the materials that they provided. We successfully, protested and denied the funding of that program by the Chinese government. But the school authorities accepted the material which I examined, and in which I found many, many instances that can be termed poisonous, to say the least. But just to say that what you don't say in the classroom is often more important than what you taught in the classroom. For example, there is a picture of Tiananmen Square, Tiananmen Gate, in that material. When you show this material to the students, are you going to mention who is the one, the image is on the Tiananmen Gate? Who's hanging there? What did he do? Are you going to mention that in the school, in your classroom programs? Are you going to mention Tiananmen Square Massacre when you see that image? No, you're not going to mention that. And you avoid that subject. By avoiding that subject, you are brainwashing American students, thinking this is a normal program, thinking this is a normal country. And when, you know, the Chinese map, when I reviewed this program's material, the first thing they see, the students will see, what China look like? So they see the Chinese map hanging there, says People's Republic of China. When you accept that title, you are already being poisoned. That's one thing. Another thing is the border, including Taiwan and South China Sea and everywhere that the Chinese authorities claim. And are you going to explain to the students that those are legitimate claims?
Let's make sure that we understand exactly what you're referring to. Chinese maps are different than perhaps the maps that we might get here in the United States. The maps that China would present as part of their educational institution without, perhaps without alerting people, would have the South China Sea as part of China's sovereign area, as well as perhaps those areas in India and elsewhere that are being claimed. Also that we, just even when we take a look at some of the other claims, for example, of Tibet and Taiwan, of course, wouldn't be mentioned at all, and those things. So you have some very good points, and perhaps I don't think that's in conflict with what Mr. Daley is saying, but let us put it this way: it could be.
It could be. My experience in the classrooms, and I'm sort of bothered by the same things. When I see these maps, I'm aware that there's some legitimacy to these criticisms, but I think it's overblown and that brainwashing is going way beyond the pale. The People's Republic of China is also the name that the United Nations, the United States government, and the House of Representatives uses to refer to China. Are they drinking poison every time they say that? No, they're using the name that they use so people can understand.
But we don't include a big picture of Mao Zedong on the front page of a document.
Well, I haven't seen it. Again, I think that it is a good idea to get beyond characterizations of the Confucius Institutes based on our suspicions and based on several anecdotes. A survey might be very much in order. I don't say that these are not concerns, but what we've heard primarily is surveys about what may lie behind them and a few anecdotes. When I've been in these classrooms with children, they're not looking at the 9-dash line if it's there on the map. They're learning that Dahai is ocean and trying to remember it and trying to learn how to write the character. And then later when they go to high school and university and they take political science, they learn about these issues. It's not a Manchurian candidate kind of situation where these old maps will be rising up to find them sympathizing.
I guess if there was a regime that had that still had big pictures of Adolf Hitler around, and I guess that there'd be a lot of people who would be naturally suspicious that perhaps the values being taught by the money that was put out by the regime that still had the pictures of Adolf Hitler prominently displayed and quotes from Chairman Hitler, that there'd probably be legitimate concern there that maybe there was some other bad messages going in there. Mr. Chen, you wanted to make one more point? Then
one more point.
Yes, sir.
The very use of Confucius' name, Confucius Classroom, is problematic to American values. I think it's fundamentally, Confucianism is against American values. For example, Confucianism is not a philosophy. It's a political ideology. It's a behavior code by which people behave according to their birth, gender, social positions, trade, governmental positions by birth, that is diametrically against American ideals that we are all created equal. So by simply using Confucius as a title and created value conflict between United States and this program, that I have to stress that point.
So you see that Confucianism itself as obviously the Chinese see it as something, the Chinese government is not doing, let's put it this way, the motive of the Chinese government in trying to put these Confucian centers all over the United States, I have to assume that they're not just doing it because they're benevolent and love us and like us, but maybe they have some other purpose in mind, but maybe I'm just too suspicious. Mr. Autry, and then we're going to...
I wanted to concur with my fellow witness that learning Mandarin is certainly a admirable goal. I have my own son in high school in Yorba Linda Placentia School District learning Mandarin. I struggle with it myself. That is obviously not the issue, and getting us to argue about that is rather a complete red herring. And of course, the Confucius Institute material is bland and boring, as he points out, because the Chinese government has learned a lot since the Cultural Revolution. They are going to be very, very subtle and very, very patient with their propaganda. And the first goal of the propaganda is to normalize the appearance of a brutal, totalitarian state with aggressive military goals aimed at America's allies and America's people. The first step in this is indeed getting people in the United States government to utter the lie, People's Republic. And I would challenge the witness to tell me that People's Republic is not a lie, along with the rest of the Constitution of the People's Republic of China, which guarantees things like freedom of religion, freedom of expression. We should never have anything in our public education system financed by a foreign government who is fundamentally hostile to the values that America represents and is building a military aimed at the people of the United States and doing what it does to its own people.
Okay, you just stated a proposition, and my last question will be for Mr. Daly.
Sure.
And then I'm going to let Mr. Carney have as much time as I've had here. What about that proposition? Should we permit a government that obviously is a even anti-democratic government, whether we call it China or whether we call it Nazis or whoever they are, should we permit them to finance educational forays into the American educational system and have them presented as something that is an equal philosophy to be considered by our children?
I'm all for the truth in labeling components of what has been suggested, but I think that the costs of limiting our own freedom and openness just because other countries are not open and free, I think that those costs are far too high, and that we can let them in the spirit of reciprocity, and we should remain true to our values, and we should fight harder for the reciprocity. We should fight, that's, okay. There is the question of how we fight for that, which we haven't touched on much today.
Okay.
And we can let them in confident. I think this is all the issues that have been raised, many of them I agree with. I think that I'm just more confident that our openness, our values, our institutions, the vibrancy of our culture, the multitude of voices that people will hear are going to overcome the nuance of the fourth graders.
Okay, but your answer then is it's okay as long as that government is agreeing to a reciprocity for us to put those ours in their society. Is that your answer?
And even when there are problems with reciprocity, as there are, we can have the confidence to not threaten our own openness just because other countries are not themselves open.
Okay,
yes.
but if there is no reciprocity, you would not make that a stumbling point. If they're not going to permit our people to have or something financed by our government or by people here to present our position there in their schools, you would not say that demanding reciprocity, you wouldn't demand that then?
Well, where we sit today, I would have probably fought for it a little bit harder up front at the get-go, but given where they are now, no, again, I think that we can be very confident in our institutions and our ability to discern propaganda, and in the meantime, be very glad that more Americans are learning Chinese. It is in our interest.
Okay, but the answer to my question is no, is that correct?
I would not close down the Confucius Institutes even if they did not open up American cultural centers, but I would fight for the
Okay,
opening.
so why would we ever expect them to open up cultural centers in the United States then? So we wouldn't. But that's okay. I mean, we are confident that our system's open and our people understand these things. Mr. Carnahan, you can have as much time as I had. Go right ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've appreciated this exchange, really covering a broad range of issues and answers here. I wanted to get back on the exchange programs that we spoke about earlier. Over the last decade, there's been strong bipartisan support in Congress that building these person-to-person relationships has been a critical contribution to our national security. I wanted to really ask each of the witnesses, what type of exchange programs are we seeing in China now? What kind of results we're seeing from them? And of course, the numbers are very uneven. They send more students here than any other country. Yet, I think the U.S., I see here is listed, I think, fifth in terms of U.S. students. China's the fifth destination in terms of numbers. And finally, what can we do to encourage more Americans to study in China to help get us back to closer equilibrium here? Why don't we start with Mr. Chen?
Yeah, thank you. I think as far as I know, if you are selected by the Chinese government to teach English in China, there are certain rules you cannot break. You cannot mention Tiananmen Square. You cannot mention Falun Gong. You cannot mention Great Leap Forward. You cannot mention Great Famine. You cannot mention Cultural Revolution. Then what's the purpose of teaching? If you set up all these taboo areas, and when you teach English in China, and once you touch those areas, you are expelled from that country. You are denied visa next round. This is how they control the academia in America. That means if you publish a paper in the US that's critical of the Chinese government, next round, they will not issue you visa. They will blacklist you.
I understand and appreciate what you're describing, but my question had to do with exchange programs in terms of what's working and what can we do to help increase the number of American students that are studying in China and learning Chinese?
Well, for me, fundamentally, the downfall of the Communist Party is the final solution. I don't know how to answer that question.
Okay, we'll move on to Mr. Autry.
Okay, thank you for your question. You note that over the last decade that these exchanges have been an important part of our, quote, national security and I think our economic interaction with China. I would point out that in my opinion, and the opinion of a number of people who I think are very educated on this subject, our economic and national security standings are much, much weaker than they were 10 years ago, and a great deal of the reason behind that is due to the actions of the Chinese Communist Party in gutting America's manufacturing base and our military supply chain and keeping us off balance in places like Korea and the Taiwan Straits on purpose. That said, what can we do about getting more American students to China? Well, first of all, our students are flooded. Our schools are flooded with Chinese students. Many of them, frankly, are really good students. I teach them. I would point out that I have been on the faculty at the Mirage School of Business at UC Irvine as a lecturer in business strategy, and as a PhD student, a teaching assistant, interact routinely with faculty who are interested in this question. often 25% or more of the students in a classroom can be from mainland China. This isn't the way that it used to be. We used to have a diverse international classroom 10 years ago. If I was in an MBA class, we'd have students from Japan and Taiwan, Germany, Argentina. Now it's the cohort of Chinese students and a few others, and it is actually, I think, not to the benefit of the school. Secondly, why should American students want to go to China? Their universities are not at all respected, frankly, in the academic community because they are not open to outside thought. They are corrupt. When you go to a Chinese university, I spoke about a year ago at Chengdu Electromechanical College. I asked somebody, what was this graffiti I saw? Because you don't see too much graffiti in China because the police are pretty tough. But there'd be these phone numbers sprayed all over campus, just a phone number. I was told, this is the phone number for the counterfeiters of academic records, and you can call and get fake test results. You can get whole fake college degrees if you call these phone numbers. Well, why don't the police get rid of them? Because the counterfeiters work with the police, so it's not a problem. I've spoken to Chinese students in America who admit that academic fraud is the norm in Chinese universities. So no, I don't see any reason why we would want to encourage more American students to go to a university system that is both subpar and politically manipulated.
Okay, Mr. Daly.
Well, number of issues. One, I would agree that Chinese universities, there are a number of problems. They are in a state of crisis, but most Americans who go there don't actually go there to earn academic degrees. They go there to have an experience in China and to improve their Chinese. And furthermore, they have access to a number of programs, including American programs in China that have been there for years. And often those American-run programs or American-affiliated programs are the most rigorous. They're more rigorous than the Chinese universities. The IUP program, inter-university program run out of Berkeley, the Hopkins Nanjing Center, Princeton in Beijing, Cornell's Falcon Chinese, these are proliferating fairly quickly. I strongly support the 100,000 strong initiative that you've mentioned, which is at the State Department, and I think that anything that the House could do to support that in the forms of scholarship support for more Americans to go, that would be helpful. I feel that the single strongest need that we have is not so much study abroad, I think that can come later, as foreign language study, including Chinese study, K through 12 in the public schools. My own view off topic is Spanish, I think, would be an obvious number one. I think Chinese would be number two. It is in the individual interest of students to study Chinese. It is in their community interest to have these programs. And again, it is profoundly in the national interest to have a large group of men and women in all of the professions who speak Chinese fluently, who know China and how to function there and still represent their profession. So I would actually put public school language programs ahead of study abroad. If we can get more students studying Chinese young, the study abroad will take care of itself. The demand will be there. One of the problems we have now is most of our students start studying Chinese in the university, and that's a little too late to get true professional fluency. After they graduate, they're getting their graduate degrees, they're getting professional training, and Chinese becomes something that they used to do. It's not deep enough in. So I see the issue as being one of Chinese in the public schools starting in the first grade.
Thank you. Next, I wanted to look at the issues of censorship. And we've certainly seen the power of internet and social media across the Middle East and North Africa. We have a pretty clear understanding of how effective and severe the censorship is within China. How do we, given that fact and those challenges, what are some of the best ways to really, ramp up our public diplomacy efforts there? And we'll start again with Mr. Chen.
Thank you very much. And I have to mention President Ronald Reagan. He taught us a lot of things in dealing with such a regime. First, you have to define the nature of the regime, like Mr. Ronald Reagan said, an evil empire. And its wall needs to be torn down, and its people need to be free. And every time Ronald Reagan went to the Soviet Union, he demanded first to meet the dissidents. But today, we don't see that. Every major US politicians, including presidents, when they went to China, they don't want to talk over the regime to the Chinese people. They don't want to talk to the dissidents. They ignore Liu Xiaobo, who still languishing in Chinese jail, and while inviting those jailers to the US through a banquet. And this is, China must be changed with the outside message from the United States, like Ronald Reagan did tirelessly. Every time he stepped on the podium during the 1980s, he talks about the principles of freedom, talks about America, talks about human dignity. That culminated through the 1980s into Tiananmen Square protest. But if we failed in that way, we either kowtow the Chinese or appease the Chinese. We are only prolong our agony.
Thank you, Mr. Autry.
Yes, your question on the internet. I have been a victim of the Chinese internet a number of times. One event that comes to my mind was a year ago, December. I was traveling from Shanghai to Shenzhen, and I was going to meet an underground Christian minister, a victim of Tiananmen Square who had done some jail time afterwards, and a human rights advocate that was coming in from Guangzhou to meet me at the Shenzhen airport. My flight was delayed for 15 minutes for, quote, ground control request, and when I got to the airport, my party wasn't there. I called them on their cell phones and texted them, and their cell phones were apparently disconnected, not just unanswered, but disconnected. I waited in the airport for quite some time at the McDonald's, our local American cultural institution, and I then emailed them and said I was going to go to my hotel and I'd be up to 10 o'clock, and if they wanted to get together to get back to me. So went to sleep, woke up the next morning, I had an email, and apparently my friends had been arrested by the police and then driven around until about 11 o'clock. They kept them away just long enough so that they couldn't meet with me, which was interesting to know that my emails, or perhaps my text messages, were being intercepted by the Chinese government. I sent an email then and said, let's meet at the Shenzhen train station across from my hotel this morning. Within half an hour, I got an email back that said the police just called me telling me not to meet the American writer at the train station. So this is the level of what's going on in the Chinese internet, not to mention the fact I can't post on Facebook there without using a VPN and going to an internet cafe and bribing somebody to get a fake national ID card. What I think we should do is prevent access to the US market by Chinese firms the same way that they cobble our firms, like making it impossible for Google to work well in China, making it impossible to get to Facebook at all. We should also prevent Chinese internet firms from having access to US capital markets. The absurdity that Rayburn, China's competitor to Facebook, gets millions of dollars from American investors in order to develop in a nurtured and protected environment to compete with Facebook that's not allowed in China galls me.
Thank you, Mr. Daley.
Yes, the original question was about censorship, including of the internet, and I think here that we have to keep calling it as we see it. It's not a subtle problem. We do need to keep raising reciprocity, as this committee does, and we have to keep on pointing out that the Chinese press is not free, and advocating for it to, for example, let the Broadcasting Board of Governors broadcast to China and its websites be unjammed and unblocked. And I think that that's something that Congress has led in quite effectively. I would also, and I think we could perhaps also ask some of our commercial networks why, when they have Spanish language channels and Arabic and other languages, why do they not even venture for a Chinese language station? It would be an interesting thing to push for and to try. I would agree with Kai Chun that a lot of American leaders of various kinds who go to China have perhaps become too accustomed to the Chinese way of doing things, and that they do not raise issues of censorship, reciprocity, press freedom, human rights as often as they used to. I think that has been a discernible trend over the past 10 years. I would agree with that. At the same time, we have to ask, if you wish to make a human rights representation, and I hope we continue to do so. How is that made most effectively so that you have the highest chance of actually freeing dissidents or changing policies and plans in China? We have to make our representations not only so that our domestic audiences can hear them and we can broadcast what we want to broadcast. The question is, how can we be most effective? How can we make representations that we know are offensive to the Chinese, and which we don't mind being offensive to the Chinese in many cases, while we also do have to work with them on a number of problems that are in the mutual interest? Part of the answer to that as America, and I think part of our strength that we can be confident about, is that we speak to China with a multiplicity of voices. So that some elements of the government tend to be a little bit more hardline and speak about human rights. Some others have to be more cooperative and work day in and day out with Chinese counterparts on issues of public health, pollution, in some cases international crime, trade, a whole number of issues. And those people simply can't be in the business of offending China, even if their principles are sound, if they are in fact going to work with China in the way that we need to. And so we need to have Americans who take different approaches to China, who speak to China with different voices, and yes, who get into Chinese institutions, agencies, and even work closely with the Chinese government to solve international problems and to model American best practices. We need people who pound the table about human rights and gradualists who work slowly through civil society organs and who work with public diplomacy. And the people who take the gradualist approach of working with China, they, I think, in the long term would have the same goals as everybody here, but they deserve to pursue their work without being called sellouts or apologists or worse.
Great. Thank you very much. I'm going to yield back my time to the chairman.
All right, the chair intends to have a very short closing statement on my part, and then Mr. Carnahan, or maybe I'll let you go first, and then what I'll do is have a very short closing statement. But I also would like to give our witnesses each 1 minute to summarize their thoughts, and so you may proceed, Mr. Chen, and we'll just give everybody 1 minute, and then we'll have a very short statements to close up the hearing.
Thank you very much. I just noticed that we're, focusing on what to do to China, but ignoring what China did to us. And when I was with the school district, the protest, I noticed the method of infiltration is through the corruption of U.S. officials. It's through our human weaknesses. They invite your officials, go to China and give you red carpet, banquets, tour, women, everything. Then you come back and pushing the program for them. So we should concern more about what they do to us now, instead of what we can do to them. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chen. Mr. Autry?
Mr. Daley, I think, made the comment that Congress has led quite effectively on this. Gee, I wish I could believe that. But we've been treading water here for 22 years with China on issues of censorship, human rights, the rest of the thing, trying to be nice and take the gradualist approach. And all we are doing is getting run over. It is time to do something.
Thank you, Mr. Daley.
I would say that we have already done a great deal. We have done most of it as a catalyst through our soft power by engaging with China and letting a range of American institutions be involved with China. I think this has already had a transformative, albeit an insufficient effect on China. I went there first in 1987. And today, while many of the problems with freedom and censorship persist, it is in fact a far better, more humane country in which most Chinese citizens in their daily lives enjoy a far greater range of freedoms, of course, as long as they don't have great political aspirations or advocate that the Chinese Communist Party loses its monopoly on power. They lead richer lives, they are physically healthier, they have access to a great deal of information despite censorship, and a lot of that is because of work that we have done in the United States, and I think we can be very proud of it.
Feel free to take an extra 30 seconds. I mean, you've actually been on the short end of some of the arguments. Anything else you'd like to say?
No, I feel I've already had the better of all the arguments. Thank you.
All
Mr.
right.
Chairman.
Good comeback. Excellent. Go right ahead.
Yeah, I was going to make that point too, Mr. Daly, but I really genuinely want to thank all of the witnesses here today and thank the chairman. You know, to Mr. Daly's point about the U.S. government speaking with different voices, we've certainly heard some different voices here today, but I think that's a really healthy thing. This, I think, is a really healthy conversation for our country. I think it's informative, and I think will help shape how we deal with some of these complex issues going forward. China, no question, is complicated. No, I think that's one thing we can all agree on. But we need to really look at what works, what hasn't worked, and how we can really move forward in a smart way. And again, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate you being an instigator on this conversation.
Always the instigator. So for my own closing statements, actually this quote came to mind with Mr. Chen's original statement here as we, in reaction to my opening statement. And that is, there's an Irishman about 100 years ago had a foreword to a book that I read, and it said that every person in the United States has two flags: the flag of the United States of America and the flag of his or her ancestral home. But he said, added this: every person in the world who loves freedom and liberty has two flags: the flag in the nation in which they live and the flag of the United States of America. I think that our identification with the cause of freedom is something that our founding fathers wanted, and that is something that gives America the strength, its ultimate strength and power in this world. Mr. Chen, you also said something that was very profound, and you talked about having people, a confusion of what freedom is, and a confusion of culture versus the culture of freedom, and wearing a Mao button. I mean, that was a cultural thing, but that really did confuse basic values. You know, what did that mean? Where did kids used to wear Che buttons, and they also have these Che T-shirts. The communist movement over the world, its history has been one of the bloodiest movements in the history of humankind. And the Chinese people are still being oppressed by those who adhere to that social structure, that concept. I do not believe that we would have this same academic discussion if we were talking in the 1930s and the Nazi regime was offering to set up Nietzsche institutes in our major universities. And I don't believe that we would have people who would be moving forward and talking about, well, this would help us understand the German culture and the richness of the German language. The folks that still control China are still loyal to the philosophy that slaughtered so many millions, and today is the world's worst human rights abuser on this planet. Today, Falun Gong practitioners are thrown into, as we speak, there's probably some people in the Falun Gong religion who are being thrown into prison, who will be murdered, and whose organs will be taken from them and sold to Westerners, whose values, as Mr. Chin had pointed out, are confused. When we lose sight of our basic values and that we value freedom above all these others, that will be the road that will take us down to the destruction of the United States of America. So today, let us stand firm and let us again celebrate, as Mr. Carnahan noted, that we can all disagree and respect each other. So thank you all today, and this hearing has been, I think, very worthwhile. We've got some areas where people will be able to discuss this in China and overseas and here at home as well with the local press. So I now say that this hearing is, it's not, we're not suspending it. What's the word I'm looking for? Adjourned. Thank you very much. God bless. This hearing is adjourned. For some reason, I wanted to say suspended, but